Jake. Well, thank you everyone for coming out today. I really appreciate all the interest that this event has drawn. So before we begin, the College Republicans would like to thank our co-sponsors of this event, the Duke Political Union and Young Americans for Liberty, as well as members of the Duke community for making this event possible. On our campus, where there are many willful and passionate young people, it took a lot of hard work and courage by a large group of people to assure that all the voices on this campus maintain the right to be heard. We'd like to give a special thanks to those who worked closely with us to ensure the success and safety of this event, including Dean Clay Adams, Selden Smith of Duke Media and Technical Services, Kristen Brown of Duke News, Communications and Media, Sarah Jane Raines and Shannon Tiffin of the Duke Police Department, Janine Weaver Douglas and John Miller of HRL, Gerald Harris and Jesse Stellini of UCA, and all other members of the Duke administration and the Duke Police Department who were involved in the process. Thank you so much. Thank you to your commitment for the freedom of speech. Personally, I'd like to thank the Duke College Republicans Chairman Colin Duffy and the rest of the Duke College Republicans Executive Board for determination and effort to see this event go through successfully. Our goal today is to facilitate a civil and engaging discussion on an issue that is interesting and very complex and very difficult. But that's what we're here at Duke University. We have these discussions. We look to further the dialogue. Finally, I appreciate all of you for attending this evening, for your intellectual curiosity and commitment to civil dialogue. Now, without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser is an American Muslim and son of the Syrian immigrants who fled the Ba'athist, is that correct? Ba'athist, yeah. Oppression in 1966. Zuhdi is a physician, a former U.S. Navy officer, and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, founded in 2003. His organization confronts the root cause of Islamist-inspired terror, Islamism, and its identity movements. His calls for reform inspired his co-founding of the Muslim Reform Movement in 2015. Zuhdi is a former commissioner and vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, appointed by the U.S. Senate, serving from 2012 to 2016. An internationally recognized expert on Islamism, Zuhdi is widely published and in the field and is featured in many top-tier media. He regularly testifies to the United States Congress to the threat of global Islamism and domestic and foreign counter-ideology strategies. Zuhdi's work is dedicated to championing universal human rights rooted in American and Western identity from within the House of Islam. Dr. Jasser's 2013 book from Simon & Schuster is called A Battle for the Soul of Islam, and you can follow him on Twitter at Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi is spelled Z-U-H-D-I and Jasser, J-A-S-S-E-R. Now, just before I bring him up to the stage, I just want to let you know, during this speech, we've laid out index cards on the chairs. Please feel free to write your questions, and our ushers will bring that to the stage when we're doing the Q&A, and we'll ask questions that way. So without further ado, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, everyone.
Thank you, Mitchell. It's an honor to be here at Duke, and I want to thank Duke College Republicans, Young Americans for Liberty, Political Union, and also the Critical Thinking Unit Project, which is a project of AHA Foundation, Ideas Beyond Borders, our American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and our Muslim Reform Movement. And as Mitchell said, it's about bringing critical thinking, challenging conventional wisdom, and thank you for the opportunity to come and hopefully give you a different way to look at I think what is one of the most important, if not the most important issue of the 21st century. I also want to particularly thank you for being here on the night of college basketball finals. I know that it may be bittersweet since Duke isn't in the finals, but our University of Arizona and ASU is also not in the finals either, so I join you with that misery. And as this venue was moved into the Devil's Den, some of my friends thought that this was a fatwa that was passed against me, a religious ruling, and that it was in Devil's Den. But then I reminded them that your mascot is the Blue Devils. So. And then they said, "What's up with the newspaper tarring and feathering you?" And they said, "Oh, was this UNC's Tar Heels?" And I said, "No, it's related to the subjects that I'm trying to talk about." And I have young kids, 3 kids, and a growing family. My kids are 16, 13, and 10, well, going on 10. And my oldest is beginning to look at universities. So I think that this is where young minds begin to think critically, begin to question authority, begin to question conventional wisdom. And I hope, and I thought about, should I thank Duke University? And I do thank Duke University. These institutions provide us a venue, provide you a venue to begin to question a lot of the ideas that have changed the world. And hopefully one of you will change the, many of you will change the world and solve the problems that we live in. And I think ultimately, as we look at some of what the controversy is, often we try to label ourselves about what we're against rather than what we're for. And you saw a lot written, and I think that in the writings, what should be highlighted and what I hope you looked at was the fact that nothing was quoted from me. And I think as you listen to the talk, yes, there's a binary question, the American Muslim identity, patriot or insurgent, but most questions, most talks, most ideas and approach to issues are based on a dichotomy of extremes. And how do we navigate those extremes? And the question is, who should I be talking to? Should this talk just be to Muslims? Is it just to non-Muslims? Is it to just Americans? Is it to folks all over the world? And we're live streaming this, and I think, as you all know in social media, that the reach of our message is never just to our neighbors anymore. It's never just to the people in the room. It's to our entire country. It's to our entire community. And I think the identities that we have a number of identities that we hold, and people that we speak to, and groups that we collectivize with. And I have to tell you, I think at the root cause of terrorism, which is the most militant little splinter problem, is sort of this identity conflict that we might have. And I look at it through the lens of my faith. And it's surprising to me that somebody who loves his faith and whose family has helped build mosques in Wisconsin, where I grew up, Virginia and Hampton Roads, where I was based, in Norfolk on a ship for a couple years, in Fort Smith, where my family helped bring together a fractionated community into one mosque. There were 3 mosques. One was African American, another was Arab American, and a third was sort of everybody else, and we brought them into one community. And now in Scottsdale, we lived in Arizona for almost 20 years. We helped build and push back against some of the protests right after 9/11, when our community wanted to build a mosque there. So, as Mitchell mentioned, it's been controversial at times to be an American Muslim. But do we allow our identity to be a reflection of the controversy around us? Or do we look at what the American dream is and what this country gave our founding fathers and what our founding fathers meant in its formation in order to form that identity? And unfortunately, as our country has fought against things and been threatened by various groups and radical movements, unfortunately, the narrative about American Muslim identity has been based on the radicalism, terrorism, etc. And I think that's an ahistorical approach. And what I want to do today is begin to, in these next 30 minutes, highlight for you what I think the battle is about and what American Muslim identity is for me, and for many that I don't think you hear from. I think, unfortunately, most of the microphone and the platforms and those that get media attention are American Muslim groups that relish in victimology, relish in victimization, and unfortunately use their platform to simply say that it's America's fault, it's the West's fault, and yet very little is done to talk about the contrition that we need to face and where we are in our history as American Muslims. And I hope you leave here understanding what Islamism is versus Islam as a faith, what Muslims are versus Islamists as a political or theopolitical movement. And contrary to a lot of the sort of propaganda that you've seen even written in your own newspaper in the past few days, I have certainly been against Islamists coming into this country, but my family and others have relished and been very grateful for being able to come to America as Muslims that could practice our faith more freely in America than we could anywhere in the Muslim world. There are revolutions happening all across the planet, and I want to quote for you before we get into some of the revolutions that occurred since 2011. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to John Adams in 1823. He said, and I want to highlight a few words in this letter that he wrote. He said, "The generation which commences a revolution rarely completes it. Habituated from their infancy to passive submission of body and mind to their kings and their priests, they're not qualified. They're not qualified." Right? Today's editorial said, "I'm not qualified because I don't have a degree in Sharia, right? I'm just a doctor." Oh, by the way, who would have thought that being a physician with a graduate education would become a pejorative, but it seems to have become a pejorative at the Duke Chronicle. They're not qualified when called on to think for them and provide for themselves, and their inexperience, their ignorance and their bigotry make them instruments often in the hands of the Bonapartes. Insert House of Saud for Bonapartes. And Iturbidis to defeat their own rights and purposes. Insert Khomeinis for Iturbidis. So you look at the founding fathers. Benjamin Rush was a doctor, but I guess he's not qualified to opine about the Christian Church of England and the fact that theocracy was the plague that prevented real freedom from growing in the West. Or I guess Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson or James Madison were not qualified because they weren't priests who understood theology to talk about whether theocracy was the right form of government for the West. And yet in America, it seems that any conversation that we try to have about the Civil War, what is the Civil War today in the Muslim consciousness? I would tell you that I think it's inside the mosques. The civil rights movement of today is inside the mosques. And yet, how many of you have heard about what's happening inside the mosques? Should we leave that conversation in the mosques? And if I have it here, does that mean I'm Islamophobic? I guess they're having a teaching about Islamophobia, a term that I've never used and I don't like, and I'll tell you about why. I think it's a term that actually is about blasphemy laws and not really about freedom and liberty. So, then to quote Eugene Rosenstock out of Revolutions, he said, "To a mankind that recognizes the equality of men everywhere, every war becomes a civil war." So we might be able to compartmentalize what's happening in Syria. And by the way, I wish Syria was just a civil war, but I mean, any of you who know what's happening in Syria know it's become a client state of Iran, of Russia, of the whole region. So unfortunately, where America is absent, those vacuums get filled by evil. So the bottom line is every revolution has its own identity, has its own movement. And in those revolutions, we saw in 2011, the people of Syria rose up. I remember my grandfather, and as Mitchell mentioned, we escaped. I was born in the US, but my family had escaped from Syria in mid-60s. There was a Ba'athist revolution, which was a fascist, nationalist, socialist movement. Sort of the Nazis of Syria took over in 1963, and they've been running Syria since that time. There were 20 different regimes, 20 different presidents that ran Syria from 1951 till 1963. Coup after coup after coup that happened. Most of which were bloodless coups because the people had no weapons, no means of defeating the military. So ultimately, it solidified with a fascist socialist movement. And then the Assads took over, Hafez Assad took over in 1970. But today, what you're seeing, what you saw in 2011, was cathartic, was a release in which finally my grandfather told my dad, and if he was able to escape because he felt the Syrian people would never take ownership for their own government, for their own society. And it really, I wish he was alive today to see what had happened. Now, obviously, it's become a genocide with two sides of the same evil coin. One side militant ISIS, Islamic fascism of ISIS, and the other secular military dictatorship, which really isn't secular of Assad. He's in bed with Khomeinists, Hezbollah, which is as theocratic as you can get. So I think it's a mirage to say that Assad is secular. But at the end of the day, lost in between that false binary choice was sort of the moderates in Syria, which thought that if they went to the streets that the world would wake up and see that people were being pegged like ants in the streets with bullets, with 150 to 100 being shot a day. Now we have 600,000 dead, 10 million displaced out of a population of 20 million. But really, the West, not that we needed military intervention, but at least to pay attention, to provide protection for those, and at least push back against other infiltrations into Syria, Russian, Iranian, and others in the region that have filled vacuums. We saw the revolution in Egypt, and while they were good protesters, they really turned out to be not very good Democrats, small d, if you will, in how to run government. So there's revolutions, and I think as you look at these revolutions and as you understand the Islamic Muslim identity in America, I do think that we have to start to look beyond our borders in America to see what to do with the Muslim consciousness and what I do with my own Muslim identity and what I teach my kids. Because we might think that all that matters is what happens on the streets here in North Carolina or in Arizona or in Illinois. But at the end of the day, the identity that we bring to our dinner tables is shaped by what happens around the world, especially when you talk about a faith identity of a people that are a quarter of the world's population. And ultimately, Islam is 1,439 years old, almost 39. What happened to Christianity at its 15th century? This is a little map, timeline map of the 30-year period in which every country in Europe was involved in major war that 8 million people died in the 30 Years' War, fighting between factions of various sects of Christianity, and the Enlightenment was growing, ideas of freedom and liberty were beginning to take root. And I know one of the most common questions I get is, who's the Martin Luther of Islam? And you know, listen, that's going to need Islamic scholars with degrees in Sharia that can begin to reinterpret Islamic law with a 21st century innovation. And I'll talk to you about innovation in a second. But what Islam needs today, before we get to Islamic jurisprudence, is it needs a John Locke. It needs a James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson. Long before, because before you can get the clerics to start to address theocracy, they have to be contained into the mosques and universities. If they control government, if they control the economies as they do in Saudi Arabia with the oil system, we see MBS, I prefer to call them MBS. We see MBS going around the country now from city to city, basically pretending to be the great reformer and other things about Saudi Arabia, and at the end of the day, it's all window dressing. He's giving you, what, a 2030 plan about how Saudi Arabia is going to change. He's not talking about changing the Islamic State mentality, changing core concepts of jihad, of apostasy and blasphemy laws. He's talking about letting women drive and all these other peripheral things that are important and are certainly huge changes, but I think we have to put in context of where Islam is. And I think if you look at how we got to where we are right now in the Islamic consciousness, looks like that. There we go. What we need is an establishment clause. We need to begin to look at that First Amendment idea of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of practice, freedom of belief, freedom of assembly. These are things that we still in America are struggling with. And what does freedom of speech mean on campus? And what are the ideas that we can and cannot address? In our Muslim reform movement, and I'm going to talk to you about this later, we believe that ideas don't have rights, human beings do. Because the moment you believe an idea, like Islam has a right, so you call it Islamophobia, you don't call it bigotry against Muslims, they call it Islamophobia because they don't want you to criticize Islam. Because Islam has rights as an idea. It doesn't have rights, no more than Christianity, Judaism, Americanism. Ideas don't have rights. They're free to be fodder for public criticism. But the history, if you will, and this is hard for you to read, but bottom line is where the Muslim consciousness and identity is today has gone through huge impacts from the 7th century when Islam was founded. So we're 15 centuries into Islam, and we started, which was a golden age in the first 7, 8 centuries. And I'm not telling you it was a perfect time, but you have to hold it accountable to the time in which it was in. You can't hold 8th century Arabia accountable to 18th century America or 21st century America. So globally, as Maimonides and Bernard Lewis talks about the golden age of Judaism and others, it was during the Islamic age. But then you had Ottomans, who were 400 years of military rule. Then you had colonial rule, which in some ways modernized technologically, but still prevented Islamic countries, Islamic majority countries, from having an identity. And then bring in the 20th century, in which you have world wars, in which the Middle East became sort of a playground for battle between major superpowers around the world, and you were left with military dictatorships. And these military dictatorships have sort of left a vacuum for any critical Islamic thinking, and many would tell you that ijtihad, which in Arabic means the modernization of critical thinking, or critical review of Islamic law in light of modern day, renewal of Islamic law is what that means, ended in the 13th and 14th century. So you've had 500 plus years of basically stagnation of Islamic thought. And yet if I, as a Muslim, use the laboratory that we have here in America to bring that light of day upon that stagnation, it's looked upon as Islamophobia requiring a teaching, which is a bit bizarre. So if you look at the map, these countries, look at the dates in which they were formed. They're barely a century old. And many of them were carved out as nation states after World War II colonial era ended. These countries pulled out and left these nation states to fend for themselves. Syria, my grandfather was involved in the first few democratic attempts at democracy in Syria from 48 to 52, and then it fell apart into military dictatorships. And part of that is, when you've been under colonial rule and the military is run by a foreign power, you're not going to be invested in the military. So what happens is the military is pulled out, the foreign military is pulled out, the most corrupt in society were in those militaries. So you were left with basically the thugs and thieves and criminals of society running the Egyptian military, the Saudi military, the Syrian military, Iraqi military, and thus you produce the Saddam Husseins, the Gaddafis, the Assads, and the House of Saud that we have today. So ultimately that became the Islamic establishment. And if there's anything I'm vociferously against, it's the current Islamic establishment. Globally and even domestically. I think domestically our Islamic establishment is a byproduct of these dictators and Middle East governments that have sprouted and planted a lot of those seeds in the 60s and 70s here in the US. So if you look at these nation states, this is a map that's hard to see, but the dark green are Islamic states. The light green is where Islam is the state religion, but it technically is not the Islamic state. And these are Muslim majority countries, by the way. The yellow is there's no declaration of state religion, and blue is secular. So as you can tell, most of the Muslim majority countries are identified as Islamic states. So I loved how during the whole ISIS debate, President Obama and even President Bush before him constantly said, Al-Qaeda is not Islamic. Islam is a religion of peace. ISIS is not Islamic. To applause of everybody at the UN. Well, sure, the UN's going to applaud. They don't want their Islamic states unnoticed. But the problem is much deeper than ISIS. The founding fathers, contrary to Rand Paul's constant talking point, the founding father of ISIS is not America or the West. The founding father of ISIS is Saudi Arabia, is Wahhabism. So the ideas that fuel the radicalization, the jihadization of the Islamist mentality are coming from the educational centers of these governments, of these Islamic regimes. To say that they're disconnected is absolutely absurd. And I think ultimately, the identity that American Muslims brought with them here has a lot of pressures. Yes, there's two extremes between hyper-nationalism and hyper-Islamism or theocracy, but to negate the fact that somehow, or to believe that somehow, as my family and others came here, that we spontaneously become Jeffersonian Democrats the moment you step into whatever state you immigrated to is absurd. There is an ideological transformation that happens. My family happened to have been political refugees from Syria, so they embraced Americanism. I think most American Muslim families embrace Americanism. But to think that they all do, I think is absurd, because what is Americanism? America is an idea, it's not a landmass. America is about individuality, our constitutional republic, about freedom, liberty, equal access to government, a separation of powers. We're a republic, not a democracy. And you know the problems with democracy, but look at what happened in Egypt. We were visiting Egypt as part of the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom, and I quoted, I think it was Ben Franklin or somebody, who said, democracy is 3 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, right? You know, and this is what happens when you have a majoritocracy. And the West right now is starting to have a challenge itself with dealing with populism. And what do you do when there are huge popular movements that might not necessarily be what the core founding principles are of the nation? And we have to deal with them. But I think ultimately our identity is one that we should be able to address. It should be more than simply my talk. Week to week, you start to look at what is it that is the fuel that makes me feel, what do I belong to? And I think often identity is about belonging. So, belonging. We all know the sports belonging, right? Which team you belong to. In Arizona, obviously, I went from being a Packer fan to being a Cardinals fan. And the Duke fans here are at a rivalry with the UNC fans. And ultimately, sports is that emotional thing. We see globally sometimes the biggest riots are after soccer games and after major sports events. So we see that that sense of belonging often drives identity. And I think ultimately that emotionalism is, I think, very healthy, as long as you look at what builds your national identity. Because if you look at the most extreme, and you can learn from the most extreme, and by talking about the most extreme, it doesn't mean that everybody fits into that most extreme definition. But you go from the mild identification stuff to the most extreme, like the jihadists. They become jihadists because at some point in their life they say, I want to die for jihad. There's something I want to die for, and these young, impressionable youth who are looking for redemption, whatever it is, all of a sudden say, ISIS is the cause, Syria is my cause, I want to go and die for that, it doesn't matter. And that's how you get 40 jihadists from the Minneapolis area and others who become radicalized. So most of right now, our largest agency in government is Homeland Security. We have a sophisticated whack-a-mole program to figure out how to counter what these guys and some gals want to die for. And yet we're doing nothing on offense. So we have a whack-a-mole trying to figure out, telling them that violent extremism is bad. We won't even name what it is, which is violent Islamism. But yet we keep telling them that's bad, we have to stop it before they get radicalized. And radicalized to us means that they went violent. We're not doing anything on offense. What is the offense? The offense is wanting to die for freedom, wanting to die for liberty. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. Was he a terrorist? He was somebody who believed the fact that the best system for society was a democracy, and he would fight against theocracy. So I think ultimately this has been why we're losing the war globally against radical Islamism, is because we don't have an offense. And when you talk about the offense, you get labeled as an Islamophobe, because within the Muslim community, I'm asking you to take sides. Not to make Islamism illegal. No, I don't think, just like in the Cold War, it was wrong to even try to put the Communist Party underground, but we didn't go to the Communist Party to tell us how to strategize against the Soviets. We realized that the best defense against the Soviets was an offense that was pro-free markets, pro-Radio Free Europe. We started to push the ideas of freedom and liberty in an unabashed, unembarrassed way, domestically and globally. And yet right now, we have no offense against political Islam. Actually, we're working with the Saudis, the Egyptian government, and other kleptocratic autocrats who are Islamic governments to tell us how to not radicalize Islamists, which is absurd. We should be working with the people on the streets that I showed you early on, who are revolutionaries that want to change and uproot their societies. Now that sounds like chaos, but if you look at the Muslim world right now, these are the global communities. Only 30% of the world right now lives in freedom and democracy. 70% lives under oppression. So that 70% has 25% that's Muslim. And that splinter of Muslims that lives in the West lives in freedom and liberty because we happen to live in the West. But to say somehow that if I was to discuss what is the role and responsibility of Muslims via our faith for fighting back against autocracy and theocracy, that somehow that's anti-Islam, I think, as the quote from Jefferson is there's nothing. Rebellion against government is, when it's for freedom, is for God. And that's one of the reasons that we're a government under God. And I think this is one of the core things, is when I look at my identity and why I ultimately joined the US Navy, was I felt that I could be more Muslim in this country than in any other Muslim majority country. These are the countries that went through the Arab Spring, which is better called the Arab Awakening. The dark maroon ones are ones still in rebellion, and violent rebellion. You've got countries like Egypt that went through a few revolutions and now are back to being dictatorships. Egypt just had an election yesterday, which was a sham. It's really lost a lot of the ground it gained. But you know, I'm very optimistic. I think that if you look at the Western revolutions, how many revolutions did the French go through as they ultimately ended up with their democracy? And revolutions sometimes take a number of iterations. So Egypt's going to go through 3.0, 4.0. Syria hopefully will not give up its struggle against Assad and against ISIS and radical Islamists. And I think all of these countries now, it's an opportunity. We can miss this opportunity and say that we want to go back to the 20th century of stability. That was a false stability. Anyone who thinks that the 20th century was a stable period of calm because there was no ISIS or little Al-Qaeda sort of rejects the notion of what created these militant groups. The Arab Tyrant Manual is that they will allow the creation of radical ideas and fester that so that they use it as an opium of the masses, and they use it to legitimize dictatorship. So the only way to change that is not through massaging the periphery, it's through chaos and revolution, and ultimately infusion of liberal ideas. Right now, we look at the Middle East like there's two choices, either theocracy or secular dictatorship. And we had our Game of Thrones period in the 20th century in which we said, oh, let's just pick the ones that are our friends. And actually, that seems to be sort of a policy we're settling back with now. That's one of the reasons I've been very excited to see Director Pompeo now going to state versus Secretary Tillerson, because the Tillersons of the world who came from the Exxon Mobil, sort of the oil industry, are not going to be the ones to really work with revolutionary periods. And I think if you look at Mike Pompeo and others that talk about the Muslim Brotherhood being the problem, that talk about Islamism being the problem, they're going to be much more open to seeing that real long-term allies in the Middle East are going to be those on the ground that are working for movements of freedom. But there can be, remember how people were upset at the binary nature of my talk. The binary nature of the Middle East is far more upsetting to me, which is both sides are evil, right? Secular dictatorships are no different from theocratic movements. Now, you could make the argument that secular dictatorships are less of a threat because they rarely have global ambitions, while the theocrats want to set up a caliphate and do have global ambitions. But that's ignoring the fact that the secular dictatorships thrive on creating radical Islamists. Just now, finally, the Saudis have said, oh, wait a minute, we didn't mean to distribute our ideas to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars globally. We're going to stop doing that. And they put the princes in the Ritz-Carlton for a few months that were part of the Brotherhood ideology movement to say that they're going to contain that. And it's hard to contain a movement that says that Islam should be ruling the world. So the civil rights movement of today, as I stand here in the South, I think that we look for what are those righteous people that want to lead real reform, real modernization. And I believe the civil rights movement of today is inside the mosques. Challenge your Muslim friends. Ask them, do women have leadership positions in their board? Is there anti-Semitism being preached from the pulpits of their mosques? Because if you don't link I don't think it's hard to debate the fact that violent anti-Semitism is precursed by non-violent anti-Semitism. Violent homophobia has a precursor of non-violent homophobia. So to say that violent Islamism of Al-Qaeda and ISIS has no precursors that includes non-violent Islamism, the belief in the Islamic State, the supremacy of Islamic rule as a majority and Sharia states, to say that that has no influence on militant Islamism, I think is to be in denial. Now, I'm ready to have that debate, and I wish that's what people would debate us on. We've had multiple debates of that with imams around the country. But I think that's really the core issue. So this is on our webpage. It's our mission at the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. It says, believers, conduct yourselves with justice and bear true witness before God, even if it be against yourselves, your parents, or your kin. This is a passage that we believe to be central. It's right out of the Quran. We believe in the authenticity of the Arabic script of the Quran, but reject the interpretations, man-made interpretations of Sheikh Google and Imam Google that you might Google to see all the translations of Islamic scripture that, now listen, I'm not saying that many of the Islamists would say, oh, that's pushed by anti-Muslim bigots, etc. No, they're actually just feeding out the Saudi government's Quranic translation. They're feeding out the Khomeini's Sharia book that's used throughout Iran. So to say that somehow it's all the Western bigots' fault of the interpretations, you need only look at the courts in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Yemen, and in Sudan, and elsewhere to see what the interpretations of Islam that need reform are. So the story is simple. The laboratory to do it is here. This is our mission statement, is to protect freedom and liberty through the separation of mosque and state. When we formed in 2003, people said, why mosque and state? Shouldn't you just be against terrorism? And we're like, no, I'm a doctor. I don't treat coughs and pain. I treat disease. You resolve the pain by treating the disease. The disease with terrorism is theocracy. And if you deny that, I'm ready to debate that with any Muslim leader, any Sharia expert or professor who my antagonist in the newspaper and elsewhere think that I'm not qualified to debate. Let's debate it. This is a public debate, not about inside the faith issues, but about public. What is the role of the theocrat and the cleric in the public place? This is a creative anthology of poetry and music that's being put by Syrian folks, many of whom listed even here. I got this from a year and a half ago. Some of them are dead already. And I can tell you that the future of the Middle East is creating and innovating. And the Islamist mentality is that innovation, or bid'ah, as they say in Arabic, is haram, is bad, that anything new that doesn't do it exactly the way the Prophet Muhammad did is bad. I do a podcast called Reform This, and in that podcast, one of the episodes I talked about was, is the Prophet Muhammad an Islamist? That's the debate. Because if I'm trying to put new things onto Islam, then I must be outside the realm of what is and what is not Islamic. So the question is I believe in the 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad was an Islamist. But there were no American secular democracies for him to use as an example, or Western societies. And Islamism, I think, was the best system at the time that existed. But I think if the Prophet Muhammad was alive today, he would reject Islamism. No different than we adopt modern medical science, computer science. Political science should evolve too. And political science in the West has evolved, and I think if the Prophet Muhammad were alive today, he would reject Islamic State identity, and he would say our primary identity of our ummah, our faith community, should no longer just be Islamic, but we are a global ummah that divides into nation states based on the ideas of that state. And unfortunately, when you talk about diversity, it's amazing. I see so many things written, as we saw in the newspapers here, about diversity and being welcoming and being afraid of the other. Why is diversity just about skin color and ethnicity and nation state of origin? Diversity should be about ideological diversity. I mean, I was called a regressive cardiologist. By the way, I'm an internist, but the regressive cardiologist that stands before you is actually considered very progressive in my mosque. While in the American concept of faith and family values, I might be pretty conservative. In the mosque, I'm considered a flaming far-left liberal. So this is the narrative that exists in the American mosque and the Muslim identity right now, and I think we need to address. My own identity we helped build the first mosque up in northern Wisconsin. I went and visited it a year ago. It's still the same size. I remember my family getting a donation request from Saudi Arabia to say, oh, we can help you build this huge mosque. And they said, you know, keep your money and help the poor in your country rather than send it to this country where we don't need it. And to this day, it still hasn't grown much as far as the physical structure, but the community has grown exponentially there. And I think my own identity is having chosen to serve in the military. And if you look at the chapel at Bethesda Naval Hospital, we added a crescent when I was there and had prayer services for Muslims. And ultimately, also, I went to Mecca when I served on the U.S. Commission and spent a few extra days there, not doing a pilgrimage since it wasn't at the right time, but at least doing what's called a Umrah. And I think if you look at Islamism, I've talked to you a little bit about that, but Islamism is different than the faith. Islamism is a political movement that believes that political parties should unite around Islamic law and the adherence and adaptation of not only a national identity that's Islamic, but legal principles that are based in Islamic law. So whether it's the Khomeinis of Iran, which is the Shia flavor of Islamism, or the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, which is the Sunni flavor of Islamism, it's all the same sort of construct or worldview, which is that the state identity should be based in Islam and not in some other identity. So the most important question I always get is, well, what percent of Muslims agree with you? And are you a mutation of the Muslim community, or what is this debate? And I think ultimately there's a continuum, just like every community, between those who are theocratic and those who are secular. Now, I wouldn't try to impart sort of Americanizing this debate, if you will, in that the debate about church and state in America is in the 21st century, while I think in the Muslim consciousness, we're still back where America was in the 16th and 17th century. So those two different debates, I think, are very different. But at the end of the day, the worldview, if you look at each extreme, you've got terrorists, those who believe that the ends justify the means, whether it's the Assads or the ISISs of the world on the theocratic end or the secular militant end. In the middle is the majority of nonviolent Muslims. And I think the debate of today, which is where I like to spend most of my time, is sort of, if you take those who believe in an Islamic worldview that there should be an Islamic state, classic debate is, if you read out of Brookings' Shadi Hamid's book on Islamic exceptionalism, I think that's the core debate, is I believe in American exceptionalism. He believes in Islamic exceptionalism. He's certainly not an advocate of terror, doesn't believe in terrorism, but I think he falls to the right of that population, and I think 30, and that's one person. If you look at the election results in the Middle East, the Islamists got 20-30% of the vote. The majority of non-Islamist Muslims divided into so many different political parties, they weren't able to win elections. And if you look in the Islamic establishment in America, what happens is most of the Islamic establishment runs the mosques and they're Islamists. I think majority of Muslims in America are non-Islamist. And ultimately, the real debate is about freedom and liberty. I'd like to see, so last one, I'll leave you in a minute with what are the solutions. I'd like to see us shift our policy in America from countering violent extremism, which is meaningless to me, to countering violent Islamism, which is countering that theopolitical movement. And people say, oh, America can't get into the theological debate. I'm not telling you to get into it, but at least work with those who share our values on the ground. So it's not that our government's going to come up with those ideas, but just as Jefferson and others fought against theocracy, we should work with the anti-theocrats on the ground in various countries. So my book is A Battle for the Soul of Islam. It's not a unique idea. President Wahid from Indonesia talked about the illusion of the Islamic State. You open his book, the first sentence says, you should have a state of Islam in your heart, but we never need an Islamic state. What's wrong with that? Is that Islamophobic? That's what I believe, is that ultimately my relationship with God is through my recipe, which is through the Quran and through Islam, but I don't want government ever involved in telling me which Islam or any religion other than being under God. Social media, I think, is a big platform for it. We can talk about it in the Q&A. There's one thing I wanted to bring to your attention. There was a lot of debate here about my using the term insurgent. The term Salafi jihadi insurgency, I think, is the best way to talk about the ideas that we fight. The Quillian Foundation did a story on a large report on Salafi jihadist insurgency around the world. This graph here talks about the number of Salafi jihadi groups around the world, and that spike happened in 2011 after the revolutions. And I think that's a natural fallout from chaos, and which I think is good. Disruption is good. Last, this was from 2 weeks ago. Al-Azhar, which is basically the Vatican of Sunni thought, the Mufti of Al-Azhar came out and said, only the state, only the government can declare jihad. Only the government can declare who's an infidel. Only the government can declare who's an apostate. That's what came out just 2 weeks ago. And El-Sisi's looked upon as a reformer. He gave that great speech about at the belly of the beast in Al-Azhar, telling them you need to clean out the radicalism and violence in our faith. So this is like going to Colombia and the Colombian government saying, only we can use the cocaine and the meth that we distribute around the world. Only we can tell you where it can be used and where it cannot. Jihad is an intoxicant of an idea that radicalizes. And our Muslim reform movement looks at ending that concept in a way that puts it into the dustbin of history. Now listen, I totally acknowledge that there exists a certain amount of palpable anti-Muslim bigotry in the West. There was a shooting in Quebec that happened, and to this day they left the shoes of the 6 Muslims that were shot in that mosque as they prayed. But I'll tell you, I think that the best way to counter any anti-Muslim bigotry, and again, don't call it Islamophobia, any anti-Muslim bigotry that exists is for Americans and the world to see us leading the battle to reform our faith. That would be the best method of melting away anti-Muslim bigotry, is rather than claiming victim and blaming the West and saying, oh, woe is us, to actually look at what responsibility we have living in the lap of freedom to change the world that exists around us. So ultimately, I want to end on, there was, let's see if I can get this. This is our Muslim reform movement. We went to mosque, posted our declaration. I put that on the seats for you to see, our 2-page declaration of ideas that we believe is sort of the goalpost at the other end of the end zone, that we're trying to get the community to, principles that we believe in that are based in Western secular ideas. And I think that ultimately through that declaration, ultimately through that declaration, it can be a vehicle. I had one last slide, which was about Manchester. Ariana Grande had a concert. What was the name of that concert? The Dangerous Woman Tour. And it was bombed. 22 people lost their lives. An act of terror happened. And her response, I had on a slide, didn't mention Islam, didn't mention Islamists, jihadists, nothing, just apologized to her fans. And yet now we're seeing so many popular folks getting all exercised about guns and other things, which is fine. I don't want to get into that. But at the end of the day, why can't we? She was targeted, I believe, because of her ideas, because of the freedom of Western music and liberty and freedom and other things. And yet we can't seem to get pop culture to respond to these very challenges against feminists, against gay rights activists and others. And as Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. You know, we can sit from here to eternity and talk about what we need to do in an intellectual way and get the professors to talk about what Islamic law really is and when ijtihad began and ended. But unless we get into the mass media and social media, as we saw with President Trump's election, it was all based on celebrity status and other things that ends up getting elected. So if we can't get this topic into the celebrity status culture, until it starts being on programs like Roseanne and other programs, nobody's going to pay attention to what we're doing. And it's not going to matter. It's not going to change the world. So at the end of the day, who are our Muslim role models? You know, I got a lot of flack in my community because I criticized Muhammad Ali. And it wasn't right at the exact time of his death, but the next day I started to hear all these things, and even Rand Paul came out with a Senate motion that he wanted a Senate position about avoiding the draft in Muhammad Ali's name. And listen, he was a man that made a lot of change, that I think stood for a lot of things and showed a lot of courage in what he believed in. But as my American Muslim identity, in his court proceedings, he said that he could not fight a war for the white man because his Quran told him he could not. So that's fine. He has the freedom to do that. But we need role models in America that base their identity also, not just, we need diversity in those role models. So I hope we can start to have American Muslim patriots, American Muslim military members. There are tons out there. They exist, but we just haven't heard about them because they're not controversial and they don't feed into the identity politic. But we're out there and we exist. So I'd like to go into the Q&A session now, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Jasser. That was a great speech. Thank you very much. I just got a word, actually, speaking of that teaching. Apparently, it's not very large from people I know who are texting me. Let's jump right into the questions. So I'm just going to ask a few questions here as moderator, and anyone that wants to participate, we will have people bringing up the index cards that we've handed out throughout the room, and you'll bring those up, and I'll ask those questions for you. So let's get right into it. I guess let's start out with an interview you had with Fox Business in 2015. You stated that in order to come up with a solution to prevent radical Islamic extremists from entering the United States, we need to have a bipartisan conversation on how you tell, quote, how you tell the difference between a Muslim and an Islamist. And you alluded to this a little bit in your talk, but can you describe what the exact specific difference is?
Sure. Listen, it's not an exact science, but at the end of the day, we're completely there without having some type of filter about understanding what Islamism is. And the Islamists declare what they're doing based on their movements. So right now, if you look at most of the immigration debate, it's about screening for background checks based on FTOs. Do they belong to any foreign terror organizations? And I think that's too narrow. I think a terror group, obviously, is those that have attacked innocents, non-combatants, and use violence as a means to obtain their ends. But what is the end? So Islamists are those who believe that where Muslims are a majority, not where they're a minority. Islamists may live in America or in Europe and say that we follow the laws of the land. They're not anarchists. They would still follow the laws of the land, but they believe if they became a majority, that the Constitution would no longer be the American Constitution, but would then be the Quran. So Islamists view the Quran as not a source, but the source of law. And I think that's one. So how do you tell that? There are ways to go through in an interview to see what their worldview is. Do they believe in Caliphism or the Caliphate, that the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, those governments that are Muslim majority should unite under one caliph, if you will? Do they believe in Sharia being the central source, Islamic law being a source of law or the source of law? Do they believe that the debate on law should be based in reason or based in exegesis, where imams and clerics determine what that law should be? Another way to tell is how open they are to free speech and criticism and what they consider to be blasphemy law. So one question you could ask them is, do they think that the Prophet Muhammad can be criticized through cartoons and degradation and other things? While that might be offensive to me, I still think it should be protected, because obviously the center of American democracy is not protecting that speech that doesn't offend you, but that speech on the periphery, like Charlie Hebdo, right? And the folks at Charlie Hebdo learned very clearly after they lost 14, 15 of their colleagues to terror what Islamists actually believe. And that's the most extreme Islamists, the Islamists that will tell you, well, okay, we don't want you to criticize Muhammad, but we also don't want you to criticize Jesus, Moses, Abraham. So they think all faiths should somehow be off limits to criticism, which I think is a sign of theocracy.
Transitioning a little bit, I'd like to go a little bit into the foreign policy aspect of things, and I guess I'm going to put you on the spot here. If President Trump called you into his office right now, and he said, what policy approach should we take to make sure that the right people are coming into our country, to make sure that we're eradicating this, as you said, Islamism in the Middle East, this violent Islamism. What do you tell him? What is the best way to go about it? And before you get fired in the next day.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think ultimately the goal of every president should be to have a strategy and a policy that they would leave after 4 or 8 years, making it less likely that our sons and daughters will have to go fight war to keep us safe anywhere. And I think even President Trump and others that might be more on the isolationist side, though he's proven to be sort of a more rigorous, hawkish, isolated nationalist, if you will, in that where conflict is necessary, he attacked Assad regime once after a chemical attack to make a point. So we're not seeing exactly pure isolationism, but I do think that what we need is a whole of government approach to where he convenes a commission on radical Islamism, and that commission on radical Islamism should include Muslim thought leaders from our reform movements and other critical thinkers, national security think tanks, different branches of government, to look at how we approach these things so that we look through the same lens. Whether it's immigrants coming here, we vet against Islamism and for those who share our values. I mean, if they're coming from Syria and Turkey and they believe in Islamic theocracy, they can go to a Middle Eastern country, Saudi Arabia or elsewhere. Why should they have to come here if they believe in Islamic theocracy? So at the end of the day, I hope you would convene a commission on radical Islamism. He talked about it in his campaign, and I hope it would, if it's chaired by some Muslim leaders and has some Muslim leaders on it, it would then begin to educate. I think some of the terminology and language that he used in the campaign, like Islam hates us and other things, I think wasn't well thought out, and I think could be thought out better by narrowing it down to Islamists, etc. I think our worldview in the Middle East should be that where America is absent, those vacuums get filled in by Russia, Iran, etc. So right now, yesterday he floated the idea of leaving Syria, and you've seen pretty universal pushback, and I think his own John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and others will push back on that and say, we've proven in Afghanistan and Iraq when we pull out, that gets ceded to other regimes like Iran and the Taliban, and in Syria would be ceded to Russia and Iran. So I don't think we need to have that many troops in Syria, but at least it needs to be palpable that we're helping the Syrian democratic forces there. And I think in the long term, if you don't want to be sending our sons and daughters to fight wars in the next 10, 20 years, we need to stop having a 6 to 12-month approach to foreign policy. The 6 to 12-month approach is a whack-a-mole program where ISIS might be gone now, but we pull out completely, they will be back in some other form or the same form in 6 to 12 months. So we have to have not only a counter-jihadist approach in the Middle East, but a pro-liberty approach where we're on the offense. And I would tell him to resurrect, and I think now we saw Heather Nauert is going to take over the public diplomacy undersecretary position, which I think is a great change, where you have somebody who was in media, that if you follow her Twitter feed, she's been very confrontational with dictators in the Middle East and others. I think the U.S. Information Agency that did quite a bit in the Cold War to push American ideas to Radio Free Europe, etc. Right now we have Al Hurra and Middle East Broadcasting Network that is only doing about 0.5% of what it should be doing globally. We are getting eaten alive. The stuff that you're reading in your newspaper about me is actually printed, a lot of it is taken off of Google from Al Jazeera and foreign Islamist media that CARE and other groups work to sort of push this narrative that's anti-American, pro-Islamist, and yet we've had no offense. So I would tell him that we need to have an offense in pushing America's ideas. If you believe in American nationalism, what our country stands for, then we should not be shy to spread our ideas of liberty.
Speaking of what we have to do here at home, President Trump and Secretary Mattis have gotten a decent amount of praise for, eradicating, getting a lot of the ISIS militants out of that territory. out in the Middle East. But a big threat, this is what makes ISIS unique, is they have the ability to influence people based on social media and create and radicalize people within countries like the United States and other European countries without physically being there. So how do we become, this is a term that always gets thrown out a lot, how do Americans become, and American Muslims, become more vigilant, and how do they deal with this to prevent this radicalization process so people like the people in San Bernardino don't come out and do these terrible things?
Yeah, I think we have to look at it instead of looking at the end point, which is the San Bernardino couple, the Boston bombers, and all of these little, they're not lone wolves, by the way. Most of these guys are known wolves who have been known to be on the fringe already in their radicalization. You have to look far before. So let's say you're countering drunk driving, right? What we're doing right now is we've deployed police to the streets. We're making sure we look for cars that are veering, et cetera, but we're looking for inebriated folks that are driving. We're not approaching the alcoholism. So what is the alcoholism in these militants? The alcoholism is the Islamist mentality. We saw after President Trump said that Jerusalem should be the capital of Israel, which is allowing the country to declare its own capital, which is unbelievable. It took us this long to do what every party has said they were going to do. We saw 4 or 5 sermons across the country on video. That's the ones we got on video, of imams in mosques from California to Virginia to Michigan and elsewhere, citing scripture that almost sounded genocidal about Muslims should kill the Jews where you find them, and on about conspiracy theories, etc. So to say that those sermons have no impact on radicalizing communities and individuals is absurd. I think that we have to start to have a tough love with our Muslim community. Interfaith work should not just be about what values we share, but what makes us different. What is the standard? When you go and visit a mosque, do they take the curtain down between the men and women just because you're having an interfaith gathering, or is that what they actually do all the time? And why don't they do that? And why is only one voice speaking for the Muslim community? I would tell you to start looking at identifying with Muslims outside the mosque. Unfortunately, right now, the Muslim identity is limited to the mosque identity and groups that you Google as Islamic in their identification. And unfortunately, 60 to 70% of Muslims don't go to mosque but 3 or 4 times a year. So their identity is yet still forming in an organizational capacity. So I think similarly, we have to start to engage our faith community in a different paradigm, and social media allows us to do that. And if you're going to counter the militants, by the time they get to find Inspire magazine that tells them how to make a pressure cooker bomb, we're way behind the power curve. We have to start with the anti-Americanism, the anti-Westernism, start telling them that secular law is not against Islam, it's very pro-Islamic, citing scripture, just like I gave you that one passage. There's 30 other ones I can give you that are pro-liberty and pro-freedom. There's some that say a woman gets half a vote of a man, a quarter of the inheritance of a man. What do we do with that? We should challenge our Muslim brothers and sisters to address those scriptures. How do you come to terms with modernity? Because those things are in our Quran that we need to address.
With that, let's turn to some questions from the audience. Okay. So I'm going to try and read these the best I can. Some of them are long. Are there chapters of the Muslim Reform movement in the Triangle area or other organizations here where people can go get involved in this work at the local level?
So our Muslim Reform movement, I left you the declaration on your chairs there. On the back is a list of the leadership that founded it. We've got a number of new leaders that have joined. And, our membership is sort of, if you look at the paradigm that we're looking at, the paradigm of the Muslim Reform movement is a sort of who are those willing to take on what Ezra Nomani has called the Honor Brigade. The Honor Brigade being those who come and will fight to make sure that nobody questions the honor of the faith of Islam and the collective of the Islamic identity. And yet, that questioning of authority is very American. So you've got Ezra Nomani in Washington, and she's from West Virginia. You've got Raheel Raza in Toronto, Nasser Khader in Denmark, who's a parliamentarian there, Osama Hassan, an imam in London, and Quillian Foundation with Majid Nawaz, and so many others that are listed there, and they each have their own organizations. We don't have anybody here that I know of in the North Carolina area, but I will tell you that, people said, if you try to gauge movements in history based on who can quickly fill an auditorium with thousands of followers, that's not where Islamic reform is in our history right now. Because in this country, we are taking on an establishment. And the establishment, right now, the Islamic establishment, is the checkoff box for, on one side of the partisan equation. You've got a partisan equation that's using the Muslim minority for partisan politics, where one side says, we will protect the Muslim minority no matter what they believe. We don't care if they're anti-feminist, anti-gay, we don't care. We just want to say we protect their rights, their civil rights, so they check the box for the Muslim minority. Then you have the other side that securitizes the Muslim identity and says that, well, everyone might be a potential terrorist, so we're the ones that are going to protect this country against the Muslim threat. Lost in the middle is 90% of America that's like, wait a minute, where's the Muslim voice? And you've got basically the Gulf Petro-Islamic voice out of Washington lobby that's speaking on our behalf, that basically says that Islam is a religion of peace, and we went after 9/11 from Islam as a religion of peace, where the negative beliefs about Islam in America were 35%. 35% of the population said Islam was a threat after 9/11. Today it's 60%. So all of these organizations in Washington have been so effective, they've doubled the fear of Islam. And I was the one listed in Duke Chronicle as fear and loathing comes to your university. And yet they're the ones who've overseen a doubling of the fear. Why? Because I think Americans haven't witnessed Muslims who are contrite and coming to terms with reform and I think a more forward approach in reform. So as a result of that context, it's going to be hard to have a large populist movement like the Tea Party and others rise up. Why aren't there Muslims in the streets? I'm told they should be marching on Washington. That's not where we are in our reform right now. We're getting together, and I have a graph and a longer talk I give about what it takes to start getting mass movements, and the tipping point is about 9 to 10% on most of these mass movements. So our constituency is not the mosque-going Muslims. Our constituency are the non-identity movement Muslims that are business folks, engineers, lawyers, physicians, accountants, students, liberal arts thinkers. We're the ones who say that if you're going to start a university in the Middle East, don't just start an engineering school or medical school like Cornell or Harvard did. Start a liberal arts school, a humanities school, journalism school. That's the schools that are not being opened in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Dubai and elsewhere, because those are threats to their regimes.
And I'm being told we are running a little short on time, so this will be our last question. You mentioned that we ought to support democratic grassroots movements in Muslim countries. Now, this is a long question, but I'll fit it in. Do you believe we ought to reject support for Israel in favor of free elections for the Palestinian Authority, or that the U.S. should have supported the democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt? In short, what about Islamist democratically elected governments? I don't know if the last part of the question makes sense, but you can answer what I've asked before.
Wow, so that question went from Israel to Islamists to all over the place, but I'll try to answer that. First of all, if you go to our website, we don't spend that much time on the Israeli-Palestinian issue because I think it's a diversion by Islamists. I think that for Muslims, Jerusalem initially was the direction in which we prayed, and then the Prophet Muhammad changed that to Mecca because he did not want to divide us against the Jewish people and other faiths, and wanted to maintain a more Islamic identity. So I think that the controversy over Jerusalem, over Israel, is exaggerated by the Islamists intentionally, the Brotherhood type groups like Hamas. But that's my personal view. I do think that the recognition of Israel we actually have principles that our members have to sign before they become members, and one of them is that we believe in the statehood of Israel. And there's only one state that's guaranteed by God in the Quran, and that's Israel. And that might sound debatable, it might sound something that would be heretical in most Islamic establishment interpretations, but it's true. The word Sharia itself you can't even find in the Quran. It's hard to find other than maybe one or two instances. So the position on Israel, I would tell you that we can get into what the peace process should be, but you need a partner with Israel that is rational, that isn't terror-based like Hamas, that doesn't have a charter like Hamas that says kill a Jew behind every stone. So part of the limitation behind the peace process is the fact that there is no moral equivalency right now between their leaderships. But having said that, the other issue is what do we do in Egypt with the Islamists who are elected? I think that it is wrong. I disagreed with the policy that somehow we should have supported al-Sisi because it is a better option from the Brotherhood. Iran is the example I always use, which is, do we look back on 79? And some people do. I think many people do say on 79, maybe Jimmy Carter was in error because whatever policies he did, if we had a way to leave the Shah in power, we should have done that. That Game of Thrones approach to the Middle East is inhuman. A state need to mature like every human being needs to mature. Their states, their nation state need to mature. And they need to evolve through a process. So 1 year of the Muslim Brotherhood running government in Egypt did more to destroy the ideas of the Islamists of Egypt than 60 years of Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak. Because those dictators intentionally didn't really leave a public place for debate. So the Arab awakening, I think, is doing a lot to begin to show that the Islamists who claim to be the alternative to military dictators are simply another dictator, but this time with religious clothes. And you need to let them come to power so that the people will revolt against them in a very nascent, organic way. Now, is that going to lead to more radicalization? Same thing in Syria. I think that, right now, when I was testifying to Congress about Syria in 11 and 12, before ISIS, I was saying the population is going to be radicalized unless we help democratic movements, and they'll get more and more radicalized. And sure enough, that's what we're seeing now. But we can't say that the lesser of evils or the enemy of our enemy is our friend and say that somehow that's a humanitarian approach to the Middle East. And I'm against a propping up of dictators because it's un-American. It really violates who we are as a country when we say we're all about liberal ideas and liberalism, but then except for the bigotry of low expectations that we have for Saudis and for Egyptians and for Syrians.
So I'm told we can go to one more, and I think this question is important, and I like that it's being asked. As a member of the Duke MSA, you recently said that Duke MSA has an Islamist agenda, that we have Islamist allies, and that our radicalization of Islam and Muslims is suffocating the Muslim identity. I'm curious how you know all of this to be true about the Duke MSA if you've never interacted with the group.
That's a great question. And the way I know that was to see the response to my coming on campus. My coming on campus was responded to with commentary on the Facebook page of the MSA that I bring. There were questions that were asked about how the MSA does not want a binary approach to their identity, that ultimately that somehow I was going to say that the Muslim identity is all about being an insurgent, is all about not belonging. And basically, the volume of information put out by the MSA here about me never quoted me. So how could that be anything but propaganda that was taken from the Islamists? And if you look at what the Islamists have said about me, it's the same stuff, which is if you look at what are Islamists, the Muslim students. I was, by the way, vice president of the MSA at the University of Wisconsin. I talk about it in my book. It lasted 3 months because I went there, I joined them when I was a freshman at the University of Wisconsin, and first of all, I couldn't understand why they were so focused on Israel. Didn't make any sense. I came from a small town, as you saw, in northern Wisconsin. Islam to me was non-political, and when I joined the MSA there, we had an international food fair, and next thing I knew, the MSA was saying that they weren't going to let the Jewish Student Union at the time put hummus out and baklava out because those are Arabic foods and not Jewish foods. And I couldn't believe that we were fighting over the ethnicity of food. Now that's my experience. Maybe the MSA at Wisconsin is different than the one 25 years later here in Duke. It might be. But I couldn't find anywhere where Duke MSA has spoken out against Islamist movements in Iran, with the Muslim Brotherhood, with a lot of things. Now you may say it's not relevant, But I would say if you're in an institution of higher learning and addressing what it means to be an American Muslim, then I would hope that you start to push back against the theocrats that exist in our faith. So I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and say that maybe you're not Islamist, but you're certainly not anti-Islamist, because I haven't seen those words. And your approach to a reformer who loves my faith, and if you look at my own values, what I am trained in is medical ethics, and I've done invocations for various religious functions in Arizona. So to address me as somebody who needs an Islamophobia teach-in as an organization, and then you end up having other organizations pull out and apologize for having been involved because you brought a supposed hate monger on campus with fear and loathing, and say that somehow me as a Muslim who's raising my kids that go to Quran school in Scottsdale every Sunday, who believe in our faith, that somehow I am the problem, rather than the millions upon millions of Islamists around the world who are feeding radicalism to our community and interpretations of Islam that we should be pushing out in social media, that where it says a woman gets a quarter of the vote of a man in court, or a quarter of the inheritance, and we aren't talking about that every day, that somehow that is less important than me, that I become the problem, then that's the definition of Islamism, where it's about a collective identity rather than I'm the problem because I question the narrative of what our identity is and the lens that we look through.
Well, I just want to say before we end here, I want to thank again the Duke administration for their help, the Duke police and the security guards that are here. Thank you for making this a safe event that protects freedom of speech and allows us to discuss very difficult topics. And to make Duke a forum for something like that is truly incredible. So thank you very much, and thank you for everyone who attended, and thank you, Dr. Jasser, for that wonderful presentation.